Remember Samuel L. Jackson's character Steven in Django Unchained? Have you ever wondered what would happen if you made that character a Supreme Court justice? No? I didn't think so, but I'm going to tell you anyway in this week's Political Figure episode about Clarence Thomas. Clarence Candace Owens Thomas was born June 23rd, 1948 in Pinpoint, Georgia, which is interesting because apparently his parents couldn't pinpoint a middle name for him because as far as I can tell he doesn't have one, which means that any middle name you decide to give him technically isn't incorrect, and I am eagerly awaiting all of your technically not incorrect middle names in the comments. Clarence grew up in Pinpoint, a small community near Savannah that was founded by freedmen to out-of-wedlock parents. So if you ever called Clarence Thomas a bastard, once again, technically, his mom was kicked out of the Baptist church for having non-Jesus approved relations, and his parents were eventually forced to get married, although Clarence's dad, MC Thomas, would eventually end up suing for divorce, claiming that Clarence's mom was neglecting the children. After being granted the divorce, like any parent truly concerned about the well-being of the children, he went on to never see his children again. Clarence then lived with his aunt for a while before moving in with his grandfather, who, despite being an African-American man in the Jim Crow South, had built a somewhat successful business. His grandfather, being a badass, used his financial success to bail out people who'd been arrested while fighting for civil rights. Clarence's grandfather, Anderson, also took his grandchildren to regular NAACP meetings and converted to Catholicism so he could send Clarence to a Catholic school. Clarence has said that his grandfather was the most influential person in his life. Grandpa Anderson, on the other hand, is currently being studied as a potential unlimited energy source after he started rolling in his grave upon finding out what his grandson, Clarence Uncle Thomas, had grown up to be. Now, as you can imagine, growing up in the Jim Crow South and being the first African-American to attend a previously segregated school, it wasn't a great time for him, but he still ended up being a pretty decent student. After the hazing got to be too much at Conception Seminary College, where he was going because he wanted to be a preacher, he moved up to Massachusetts and went to the College of the Holy Cross, which was a tad bit more inviting. Here, he started getting heavily involved in civil rights activities on campus, helped founding the Black Student Union, putting a picture of Malcolm X up on his wall, and getting involved with the Black Muslim movement and the Black Power movement. He continued to do well in school and would eventually go on to Yale to get his Juris Doctor. At Yale is when Turncoat Thomas's anamorph transformation into a bottle of syrup you can't buy anymore began. And it began with none other than John Bolton, and not how you would think John Bolton brought him to the dark side. Bolton simply found a wallet that Clarence lost and returned it to him. So John Bolton, the behind-the-scenes supervillain who has been a scourge and plague on humanity since Ronald Reagan brought him to Washington in the 1980s, found Clarence's wallet and gave it back to him while he was at Yale. And Clarence Thomas, who is so weak in his mind and moral convictions, was like, sure, I will consider abandoning all of my principles and ideologies because this nice conservative man didn't steal my wallet. Obviously, it's a tad bit more nuanced than that, but no joke, that is what opened the door for Clarence's transformation from Anakin to Darth. He graduated from Yale with his Juris Doctor in 1974. Then he set out with a desire to get a job right away as a high-paid corporate lawyer in Atlanta, Georgia, because, you know, he's a horrible person. However, it was the 1970s, and he soon realized that it was going to be tough to get hired by a high-paying corporate law firm with no experience, and as a black man in Georgia in the 70s. Now, he was offered a job by the law firm he interned with in Savannah, but they weren't high-paying or in Atlanta enough for him. And it was at this point he made up his mind that the reason he couldn't get the job was not because he was an inexperienced black man trying to get a high-paying job in the 70s in Georgia. It was, in fact, affirmative action's fault that he could not get hired at a high-paying law firm in Georgia in the 1970s as an inexperienced black man in Georgia in the 1970s. He's like, these law firms aren't taking me seriously because they think I just got into Yale because of affirmative action and not on my own merit. And if it wasn't for affirmative action, these law firms would be lining up. But because of affirmative action, an inexperienced black man can't get a high-paying white-collar job in Georgia in the 70s. Okay, I feel like I've beat this one to death, but people, this man is a fucking Supreme Court justice. And he genuinely believes this so much in his core that he peeled off a 15-cent cigar sticker and stuck it to his Yale diploma to remind him how worthless that degree was. You know, the same degree that afforded this man the opportunity to have a career that led to him being a Supreme Court justice. A career that started as the Assistant Attorney General of Missouri when he couldn't get the corporate job that he wanted. After he got some experience doing that, he went on to work for Monsanto's legal department. Because, you know, if you're pursuing a career as an evil corporate shill in Washington, it helps if you've done some corporate shilling for one of the most evilest corporations in the world. After obtaining his evil corporate shill credentials, he went to Washington, D.C. to be a legislative assistant for Senator Danforth, whom he'd worked for in Missouri. During this time, he changed his party affiliation from Democrat to Republican. That set off the Reagan administration administration's spidey senses, because of course it did. They're like, hey, you know, we're not very popular with the people of color, and it's been really hard to find non-male colored conservatives to help with that imaging problem. Maybe we should hire that guy. And at that point, Clarence Thomas, who apparently only has a problem getting hired because of his skin color if it's affirmative action related, started working for the Reagan administration. He held a few different positions within the Reagan White House, but he was most notably the chairman of the EEOC, and he was actually really good at the job. Settlement awards tripled, he was credited with increasing the efficiency of the agency, and he even opposed Ronald Reagan's attempts to get rid of affirmative action despite not being a big fan of it. In '89, he became a District Court of Appeals judge under Daddy Bush, and then in '91, Daddy Bush nominated him for the Supreme Court, and that was not popular. During this time, it was leaked that he had a long history of harassing women, allegations which were corroborated by a number of people. It came out that apparently he referred to himself as Long Dong Silver in the workplace when he was trying to pressure women into dating him who didn't want to date him. He was rated as adequately qualified by the American Bar Association rather than well qualified for a Supreme Court position. And despite being the second African-American man nominated to the Supreme Court, the NAACP refused to endorse him because he was so anti-African-American. He was also considered young, inexperienced, and inconsistent. This only went on to convince conservatives that he was the perfect man for the job, and he was finally confirmed after one of the longest nomination periods in history and the narrowest margin of votes within the last century, at least at that particular time. Once getting on the court, he became the most conservative judge in history. So conservative that even Justice Scalia at times was like, whoa man, that's a little fashy even for me. He likes to claim that he's an originalist of the Constitution, interpreting the Constitution as it was written in the spirit that the Founding Fathers wrote it in, which is ironic because the spirit they wrote it in would have him focusing more on cotton than the Constitution. He's also really only an originalist when, you know, it's convenient. Like, he doesn't believe in Roe v. Wade or affirmative action because those things weren't written into the Constitution. But he's a big fan of judicial review, which is that thing in Marbury v. Madison where the Supreme Court gave itself the power that the Supreme Court has, despite that not being anywhere in the Constitution. He loves the First Amendment if it has to do with allowing corporations to spend unlimited money in politics, because that is definitely what the Founding Fathers intended by free speech, even though that's definitely not written in the Constitution. But he's also ruled and stated that minors have no First Amendment rights, because, you know, the Founding Fathers famously wrote that Congress shall make no law prohibiting free speech, unless, of course, that speech is coming from somebody who has not lived a arbitrary number of years yet. He also wrote that while Texas's sodomy laws were silly, they were not unconstitutional because the Constitution does not afford us any expectation of privacy. Just never mind that part in the Fourth Amendment about the unreasonable search and seizure. Sort of feel like enforcing sodomy laws has some, unreasonable searching involved. Also, if you can't be unreasonably searched, that would sort of be an expectation to privacy, at least according to like every other judge in the history of ever. Also voted and written in favor of allowing police to stop, search, and seize property regardless of if they are suspicious that they've even committed a crime, because, you know, he's an originalist. In fact, he pretty much always rules in favor of police and police action in any situation, which is interesting because there's not much about police in the Constitution or anything that the Founding Fathers said, except for the fact that they probably didn't want something like what resembles a modern police force in the United States. They had some strong feelings about a standing army, you know, militarized police force, standing army, He's pretty much also always ruled in favor of increasing executive power because, you know, the Founding Fathers were all about one executive branch having all of the power. That's why they didn't write anything about, you know, equal branches of power or anything like that. He's also voted or written dissents in opposition to anything protecting gay marriage or interracial marriage, which isn't ironic at all considering he's married to a white woman who actually committed treason trying to use her influence to overturn the 2020 election, something I'm sure the Founding Fathers would have absolutely approved of. That, however, didn't seem to be something that Clarence Trader Thomas felt was recusal worthy when it came to him hearing cases about January 6 or 2020 election interference. He was also the biggest driving factor in overturning Roe v. Wade. And when protesters were protesting outside of his house, he's like, the Supreme Court will not be bullied. We do not exist to do what the people want. He literally said, we are becoming addicted to wanting particular outcomes, not living with the outcomes we don't like. The irony of a man who is the second black Supreme Court justice in the history of our country, whose great-grandparents were literally property, who grew up in the segregated South, telling women that they need to get over it and live with the outcome of his decisions that they don't like regarding their bodily autonomy and freedom, cannot be overstated. On top of all of that, he has also been instrumental in consolidating the Supreme Court's power and shielding them from any accountability whatsoever, which is important when you're just going to straight up accept bribes for your entire career. He's been accepting gifts, expensive gifts like cars and shit, luxury vacations, private jet rides, all kinds of favors from wealthy GOP donors and businessmen, many of whom were going to be affected by cases he was overseeing and who he has almost always ruled in favor of in those cases. The fact that people are forced to address him as honorable and have to try to keep a straight face doing it is cruel and unusual punishment. Speaking of cruel and unusual punishment, he was also the sole dissenter in a case where the Supreme Court decided that prison guards beating prisoners was cruel and unusual punishment. We're also probably well aware that he is most recently behind overturning Chevron and saying that presidents are, pretty much above the law. And those, along with overturning Roe, Jackson v. Dobbs, and affirmative action, will be some of the most damaging decisions the Supreme Court has ever made in the history of our country. Silver lining is that he is 76 years old, and with any luck, he'll be providing the world with another gender-neutral bathroom soon. But as bad, as despicable, as evil, as pathetic, as spineless as Clarence Thomas is, remember that you are voting for his replacement in November. Remember that whoever is in the Oval Office when he retires or rids the world of the plague that is his continued existence gets to pick who will replace him and fill his seat on the bench of the Supreme Court for a literal lifetime. And that vote may have the biggest tangible effect on anything you've ever voted for you, your children, your grandchildren, and your great-grandchildren. So please make good choices, folks. Don't force me to have to learn about whatever's out there that is worse than the primordial scum that is Clarence Thomas for one of these videos in the future. I'd really prefer to not have to do that.